Now this brings me to another interesting elaboration. Aspasius links the paradox of the heap to our theory of virtue and to the question of blame and praise. But for now, just let me focus on the virtue question. It seems at first glance as if that's an odd connection. But let me explain. First, what is the paradox of the heap? It's also known as the Sorites paradox, or the paradox of the bald man in ancient texts. But the idea is this. One grain does not make a heap of sand. But if you add just one grain to something that isn't a heap, that's not enough of a difference to turn it into a heap of sand. Well, it would seem to follow then that there are no heaps of sand. Or let's start at the other side. Take a heap of sand. Subtract just one grain. Surely it's still a heap. But we can keep doing that. Eventually we get down to one grain of sand. But apparently it's still a heap, because taking away one grain can never make the difference. The same might be true of baldness. We surely count somebody bald if they have no hair at all. Well, having just one hair on your head, you're still bald. Adding one hair doesn't seem to make a difference. But it seems to follow from that, well, for example, I am bald. But that's ridiculous. Take somebody who's really hairy and obviously not bald. Take away one hair. Well, surely they're still not bald. The difference of one hair can't be, it's not even perceptible. But in the end, well, that suggests that somebody with only one strand of hair, or maybe no hair at all, still has hair, isn't bald, and that's absurd. Here is Aspasius on the paradox of the heap. It is impossible to determine exactly anything in matters of action, but rather in outline, nor indeed anything else among perceptible things, whence too the heap puzzles, Sorites, derive. For up to what point is a person rich? If someone should posit that it's someone who has as much as 10 talents, they ask, but if someone should take away a drachma, is he no longer rich? Or if 2? For it's not possible to determine exactly any such things, since they're perceptibles in respect to the rich man and the poor. In the case of the bald man, too, they ask whether he becomes bald by the loss of one hair, and what about 2, and what about by 3? From this, the arguments are called bald as well as heap. For in the case of a heap, they used to ask the same thing. If a heap is made smaller by 1 grain, is it no longer a heap? And then if by 2, and so on. And it's not possible to say when first it's no longer a heap, because no perceptible things are grasped exactly, but rather broadly and in outline. It is thus too then in the case of actions and emotions, for it is not possible to say that a person who is angry to a certain extent is being angry at the mean, or is excessive or deficient because a deviation by a small amount to the greater or to the lesser escapes notice. This is why one needs practical wisdom, which recognizes the mean in emotions and in actions. Now notice there, Aspasius does seem to be taking the epistemesis view that Aristotle advances. He says it's hard to say, we can't tell, it is not possible to say that we're getting it to the right extent. That's not to say there is no such thing as one right extent, but on the other hand, we might really think, look, distinguish the question of what that intermediate thing is, a point or a region, from the boundary conditions. Is there a clear-cut boundary? Those are different questions. And so saying, look, there are clear-cut boundaries advances the epistemesis point, but it still allows us to say that there might be something in that region as opposed to just the single point that counts as intermediate and thus virtuous. Now you can find this kind of paradox in many different settings, but here Aspasius focuses on the question of virtue. And so think about an example proposed by Warren Quinn. Let's say someone suffers a disappointment, and someone who cares about them, a parent, a child, maybe a friend, gives them an encouraging pat on the back. It's a kind action. Well, you might say if they patted just imperceptibly harder, so that neither one could tell the difference. It would be strange to say that's not unkind. After all, if kindness is a point, as Aristotle seems to say, well then even the slightest variation from that would really count as no longer virtuous, no longer kind. But that seems strange if neither the person giving the pat on the back nor the person receiving it could possibly tell the difference. And so we might think, yeah, if it's imperceptibly harder, surely it still counts as kind, it still counts as virtuous. But now we can keep doing that, make it imperceptibly harder again and again, and finally we get down to the point where this is a slap on the back, maybe even hard enough to cause injury. Well, wait a minute, clearly that's not kind, that's not virtuous. And so what happened there? In each case we said, well look, somebody can't even tell the difference. And so surely it still counts as kind, it still counts as virtuous. But finally we get to the point where something that hits hard enough to cause damage counts as virtuous. That's ridiculous. Or we could back it up. Something that's a serious slap that causes injury, surely not kind in response to that person's disappointment. But then change it imperceptibly again and again and again. Finally we get to what appears to be the encouraging, kind pat on the back. And so what are we to say in response to this? Now I think it's interesting that Aspasius not only takes this as a complaint against Aristotle, but says that Aristotle himself thought of it this way. Well, if that's true, then we do have a kind of puzzle here, and a puzzle that relates to our question about, in particular, whether we should think of virtue as a point or a region, if it's some kind of intermediate between extremes. After all, we might think, well, surely it must be a region, because if I'm patting you on the back and it's a kind action, and then I do something imperceptibly softer or harder, surely that should still count as a kind action. But then I can continue doing this throughout a certain region. Now, intuitively, we want to say, well, look, eventually, for example, if you lose enough hairs on your head, you do become bald. Eventually, if you hit somebody harder, it's going to become something that no longer counts as kind. Eventually, if you take grains of sand away from a heap, it turns into a small pile and no longer something we'd call a heap. And so we have a certain region here where we consider something a heap, or we consider something kind, or we consider someone to have hair. And then there's a certain region where we clearly think it's unkind, or we think the person is bald, or it's plainly not a heap. And then in between there might be a region where we're not sure what to say. We might say, well, it's kind of a heap, or, well, it's a small heap, or maybe that person's getting a bit bald, or something like that. Or we look at the action and we say, I don't know if that was encouragement or punishment. And so there might be this vague case, a vague series of cases really, of borderline cases where we're not quite sure what to say, where we say, well, it's kind of, it's sort of, maybe, etc. Now, that's the way vagueness often looks. And you might think then that heap, for example, or bald, or in this case kind or virtuous, are really vague predicates. There is a region of vagueness. Now, if that's right, then we want to say, look, I think the right thing to say here is that it really is a region that is the intermediate between extremes, and that there might be vague boundaries on both sides, borderline cases where we're not sure what to say. Is that virtuous or not? That's one alternative, and I think it's quite an appealing alternative in intuitive terms. But it does seem as if Aristotle, most of the time, talks about this as a point. And there is that kind of reaction as well when people deal with questions of vagueness. We might think that actually there is not some vague borderline region, but instead that it's clear-cut. Now, one way of doing that is to say there is one point. Baldness is having no hair, period. We might say similarly that a heap of sand is having, well, in this case now, it seems like we can get larger and larger. And so, but we might just say, no, it's not a heap if it's below 1,000,000 grains of sand. That's it. It's a heap if it's at least 1,000,000 grains. Well, I don't know how big 1,000,000 grains of sand is, so I don't know how plausible that particular way of putting it would be. But the idea then would be there's a very firm line we can draw. Now, I think two things can be said here. One is, Aristotle does talk as someone who is, well, in contemporary terms, an epistemicist. Someone who does think there's a very clear, sharp line The feeling of uncertainty is uncertainty. We're not sure where it is. It's an epistemic problem, a problem about knowledge of where to draw that line, rather than the existence of the sharp line. And in fact, in that way, we could say, actually, there is a single point. Now, the hard part is telling where it is. It's true, there's a region that's kind of imperceptibly different from that right point. But that's why we need practical wisdom, the ability to have the sensitivity to discern the difference between that point and other counterfeits around it. So that, I think, is Aristotle's dominant answer to this. But we might have another option as well. And in fact, when we come to imperfect virtues, and here's Aspasius' idea, we really have to say it's a region and not a point. Why? Because this action should be able to count as courageous, even though this other one is even more courageous. This action might count as kind, even though another might be even kinder. And so I think from Aspasius' point of view, we could say that the perfect virtues like correctness and justice are, well, yes, points, and the boundaries are very clear-cut. However, imperfect virtues like kindness and courage, those have to be regions. The boundary may or may not be clear-cut, but we can't take them simply as points.